A 67-year-old woman inherits an abandoned train station from a brother she hasn't spoken to in years. Everyone tells her to tear it down. But what she finds inside, dozens of unclaimed lockers filled with strangers' forgotten lives, changes everything. And when the people who want the building gone discover what she's really uncovering, they'll wish they had never pushed her. If you've ever felt like a burden, like you were carrying something nobody asked for and nobody thanked you for, this story is for you. Stay with me, because what happens inside that station is going to change the way you think about the things we leave behind. But before I tell you about the lockers, before I tell you about the photographs and the baby shoes and the violin that hadn't been played in 40 years, let me tell you about the woman who almost walked away from all of it. Marta Backwood was 67 years old when the letter arrived. It was a Tuesday in November, cold and gray, and she was sitting in her one-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, eating canned soup for the third night that week. The envelope was thin, official, and it bore the return address of a law office in Harwick, Pennsylvania, a town she hadn't visited in over 20 years. Her older brother, Gerald Backwood, was dead. He had died alone, in a house she had never seen, in a town she barely remembered. The funeral had already happened. Nobody had thought to call her. The lawyer's letter was polite, efficient, and final. Gerald had left her one thing: not money, not an apology, not even a note. He had left her an abandoned train station, the Harwick Junction Station, built in 1923, closed in 1987, sitting on a quarter-acre of cracked asphalt at the edge of a town that had been slowly emptying for decades. The roof leaked, the platform was crumbling, the windows were boarded, and it was hers now, along with 2 years of unpaid property taxes, a lien from the county, and an outstanding code violation from the township. Marta stared at the letter for a long time. Then she folded it, put it beside the soup can, and said nothing. Because that was what Marta Backwood did. She said nothing. She carried things quietly and alone. And she never complained, and she never asked for help. And she had been doing it for so long that she had forgotten she was even doing it at all. Let me tell you about the decades that brought her to that soup can. Marta had grown up in Harwick, a railroad town in western Pennsylvania, where the trains used to pass through 6 times a day. Her father, Owen Backwood, had been a signalman for the Baltimore and Ohio line, and her mother, Arlene, had worked the ticket counter at Harwick Junction, the very station that was now rotting at the edge of town. Gerald was 7 years older, quiet, strange, always disappearing into the station after school to tinker with things, to collect things, to sort and label and organize in a way that made no sense to anyone but him. Marta was different. She had a gift for listening. People told her things, their worries, their stories, their secrets, without knowing why. By the time she was 16, she was transcribing oral histories for the Harwick Historical Society, filling notebooks with the words of miners, railroad workers, school teachers, and farmers. She had planned to study archival science at the University of Pittsburgh. She had dreamed of preserving the stories that nobody else thought worth keeping. But in 1977, her mother got sick. Arlene was diagnosed with early-onset dementia at 51, and Owen, proud, stubborn, terrified, refused to ask anyone for help. So, Marta stayed. She was 18. She canceled her university enrollment. She nursed her mother through 7 years of slow forgetting while her father worked double shifts, and Gerald drifted further and further into his own strange world, barely speaking, barely present. By the time Arlene died in 1984, Marta was 25 and felt 50. She had no degree, no savings, no career. Gerald, who had barely visited during their mother's illness, inherited the house. He didn't offer Marta a room. He didn't offer her anything. "You'll figure it out," he said at the funeral. "You always do." She did figure it out. She always figured it out. Marta moved to Columbus with $300 and a suitcase full of clothes she had bought at a church rummage sale. She got a job as an administrative assistant at a community college, Westfield Community College, a low brick building on the edge of the city where the parking lot was always full and the heating was always broken. She answered the phones. She scheduled the meetings. She filed the papers. She remembered every professor's allergies, every dean's anniversary, every adjunct's contract renewal date. She organized the commencement ceremony 17 years in a row without a single mistake. When the provost retired, he thanked his wife and his assistant dean in his farewell speech. He did not mention Marta. She was in the back of the auditorium, holding the backup copy of his speech in case he lost the original, which he did. She never married. She dated a man named Frank Howell for 11 years, a decent, square-shouldered man who sold insurance and brought her flowers on Valentine's Day and called her dependable. He said it often, to friends, to his sister, to waiters. "Marta's dependable." She smiled every time he said it, and every time it landed in her chest like a small stone. Dependable, not beautiful, not brilliant, not irreplaceable, dependable, like a car that starts in winter, like a watch that keeps time. Frank left in 2003 for a woman named Sandra who worked at his gym and was, in his words, a little more exciting. He told Marta on a Sunday evening in the kitchen while she was washing the dishes from the dinner she had cooked for him. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. He did not have the decency to help her dry the plates. Marta did not argue. She did not cry. She packed his things into 2 boxes, left them on the porch, and went back inside to finish the dishes. The water was still warm. She worked at Westfield until she was 64, when the college restructured and eliminated her position along with 11 others. Her supervisor, a man 20 years younger who had been at the college for 3 years, told her the decision was purely organizational. He shook her hand and gave her a card signed by the department. The card said, "Thank you for everything." It did not specify what everything was. Her severance was 4 months' pay. Her pension was modest. Her savings, after 40 years of paying rent in a city where rent never stopped climbing, were thin. She had spent 4 decades being the person who kept things running, who remembered what everyone else forgot, who organized what everyone else left in chaos, who showed up early and stayed late and never once asked for a raise. And now there was nothing left to run. And then the letter came. Marta drove to Harwick on a Saturday morning in late November, expecting to sign papers, meet a realtor, and leave. She imagined a quick sale, perhaps to a developer, perhaps to the county, enough to pay off her credit card debt, maybe fix the leak in her apartment ceiling. A small, manageable transaction, a final burden from a brother who had never given her anything but burdens, wrapped up and disposed of in a single afternoon. Harwick was smaller than she remembered. The main street had 3 empty storefronts for every open one. The diner was still there, but the hardware store was gone, the pharmacy was gone, and the old movie theater had been converted into a self-storage facility. Population signs at the edge of town had been updated with a number that was lower each time she passed. Now it read 1,140. She parked in front of the station and sat in her car for a long time. The building was worse than the letter described. Ivy crawled up the east wall. 3 windows on the upper floor were shattered. The platform along the track side was buckled and split. with weeds pushing through the concrete in thick green tufts. The iron letters above the main entrance, Harwick Junction, were rusted but still legible. The door was padlocked with a chain so old it had turned the color of dried blood. The lawyer, a young man named Peter Cavell, met her at the entrance with a clipboard, a key, and a face full of polite sympathy. "I should tell you," he said, unlocking the chain. "There's been some interest in the property already. Mayor Breslin has been talking about this lot for years. There's a plan to put in a regional storage facility. You know, climate-controlled units, that sort of thing. Dale Hunton, he's the one behind it. He's been asking about a timeline." "A timeline for what?" Marta asked. "For demolition." They stepped inside. The main hall was vast and cold. Dust hung in the air like suspended time. The ticket counter was still there, a long oak slab worn smooth in the middle where 10,000 hands had slid money and tickets across its surface. Behind it, the back office, the waiting benches, the high-arched windows that had once let in the morning light but now let in only gray. And then Peter Cavell opened the door to the east wing. Marta stopped breathing. Lockers. Dozens and dozens of metal lockers, floor to ceiling, lining both walls of a long corridor that ran the full length of the building. Each one was closed. Each one had a small tag wired to the handle, a date, written in Gerald's precise, angular handwriting. No names, just dates. Some from the 1990s, some from the 2000s, a few from as recently as 2023. "What is this?" Marta whispered. Peter Cavell shrugged. "Nobody really knows. Your brother kept this wing locked. We only opened it after he passed." Marta reached for the nearest locker and opened it. Inside was a violin case. She unlatched it. The instrument was old, well-used, and beautiful. A small card was tucked beneath the strings. Left behind. Platform bench. June 14th, 2001. She opened another. A stack of handwritten postcards tied with kitchen twine addressed to someone named Dolores, never mailed. Another. A pair of baby shoes, white leather, barely worn. A folded baptismal certificate dated 1978. Another. 3 composition notebooks filled with recipes in a shaky elderly hand. Soups mostly. Page after page of soups. Another. A railroad uniform, neatly pressed and folded, with a name stitched above the pocket. R. Czerny. Marta opened locker after locker, her hands trembling, her breath catching. Photographs of strangers, a set of watercolor paints, a high school diploma, a music box that still played when she wound it, a bundle of letters in a language she didn't recognize, a child's drawing of a house with smoke coming from the chimney, and a family of stick figures standing in front. Gerald had been collecting these things for decades. Objects left behind on platforms, in waiting rooms, in the station itself after it closed. Things forgotten by travelers passing through, never claimed, never returned. And instead of throwing them away, he had cataloged them, stored them, and locked them up in the silence of an abandoned building where nobody would ask questions. Marta stood in the middle of the corridor and wept, not for Gerald, not yet, but for the sheer, staggering weight of it, all these ordinary lives, all these small, unclaimed pieces of people who had moved on without them. "Why didn't he tell anyone?" she said. Peter Cavell had no answer. She was supposed to leave that afternoon. She didn't. The first week was chaos. Marta checked into the Harwick Motor Lodge, 12 rooms, only 3 occupied, and began going to the station every morning at 8. She brought a flashlight, a notebook, and a thermos of coffee, and she started cataloging. Each locker, Each object, each date. The resistance came fast. Mayor Tom Breslin showed up on her third day, a heavy man with a firm handshake and a firmer agenda. "Mrs. Backwood, I understand you're Gerald's sister, and I'm sorry for your loss. But I want to be honest with you. This building has been a blight on Harwick for 15 years. Dale Hunton has a plan that would bring jobs, revenue, a real future. I'd hate to see that held up by sentiment." Dale Hunton himself came the next day. Tall, tan, expensive watch. He spoke to Marta the way people speak to elderly women they assume are confused, slowly, loudly, with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I'll make you a fair offer, Marta. 40,000 for the lot. That's generous given the condition. You could be back in Ohio by Christmas." "I'm still looking through the building," she said. "Looking through it for what?" Dale laughed. "It's junk. Gerald was, I don't want to be unkind, but he was a hoarder. Everyone knows that." Marta said nothing. She closed the door. But it wasn't just the mayor and the businessman. Some of the townspeople were hostile too. A woman at the diner told her bluntly, "Your brother was a strange man. People left him alone, and he left them alone. Nobody needs you coming here and stirring things up." A man at the gas station said, "That station should have been torn down 10 years ago. It's an eyesore. You're wasting everyone's time." Marta, who had spent her entire life avoiding conflict, who had let Frank walk away without a word, who had let Gerald take the house without protest, who had let the college fire her without complaint, felt something unfamiliar tighten in her chest. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and more dangerous. Resolve. She stayed. The first person to help was the last person she expected. Jenna Merrick was 17, court-ordered to complete community service hours after a shoplifting charge, and visibly furious about being assigned to help the old lady at the train station. She showed up on a Monday morning in a black hoodie, earbuds in, arms crossed. "I'm not touching dead people's stuff," she announced. "Good," Marta said. "You can sweep." Jenna swept. Then she got bored and started reading the postcards from the locker marked September 3rd, 2007. She sat on the floor for an hour, cross-legged, reading silently. When she looked up, her face was different. "These are from a woman named Dolores to her daughter in California. She wrote one every week for 2 years. She never sent them." "Why not?" Marta asked. "I don't know, but the last one says, 'I forgive you.'" Jenna came back the next day without being asked. The second was Walt Penrose, 74, a former brakeman on the B&O line, retired and widowed, and spending most of his days at the VFW hall drinking coffee and arguing about baseball scores from 1983. He showed up because Marta had found a railroad uniform with the name R. Zerny on the pocket, and she'd asked at the diner if anyone remembered a Cherney. Walt remembered. Rudy Cherney. He was a conductor. Good man. Moved to Erie in '89 after the line shut down. Must have left his spare uniform in the station locker room. Walt paused. "You know, his granddaughter runs a bakery in Meadville. I could make a call." The third was Elaine Poole, 58, editor of the Harwick Messenger, a weekly newspaper that was down to 12 pages and running out of reasons to exist. Elaine was skeptical, reserved, and asked sharp questions. "What exactly are you trying to do here, Marta?" "I'm trying to return these things to the people they belong to. And if you can't find the people, then at least the things won't be forgotten." Elaine wrote a small article. It ran on page 6. Within a week, Marta's phone, the station's old landline, which she'd had reconnected, was ringing. A woman in Pittsburgh called about the baby shoes. They had belonged to her nephew, born in 1978, who had died at 3 months. Her sister had carried them everywhere for years and must have left them on a bench during a stop in Harwick. The sister was dead now, but the woman wanted the shoes. "I thought they were gone forever," she said, and her voice broke on the word forever. A retired teacher in Johnstown called about the music box. It had been her grandmother's, given to her mother, and somehow lost during a family move in 1995. My mother asked about it on her deathbed. I told her it was just misplaced. I lied. Rudy Cherney's granddaughter drove down from Meadville and stood in the station holding her grandfather's uniform against her chest, crying without sound, while her 2 small children watched with wide eyes. Each return changed something, not just in the person receiving the object, but in the town. The stories spread. People began coming to the station not to complain, but to look, to remember, to ask, "Is there anything in there that might be mine?" Walt began spending every afternoon at the station, helping Marta sort through military records and railroad employment logs to match objects to families. Jenna, who had never cared about anything beyond her phone screen, developed an extraordinary talent for research. She could find a family connection through 3 generations of public records in under an hour. Elaine moved the station story from page 6 to page 1 and kept it there. Dale Hunton was not pleased. He came back in January, this time with a lawyer and a printed offer. $55,000. Final offer. You're sitting on a code violation and 2 years of back taxes. The county will condemn this building if you don't act. Then let them condemn it, Marta said. She was standing behind the oak ticket counter, and she did not look away from his eyes. "I'm not finished." "Finished with what?" Dale's smile was gone now. "Playing museum? This isn't a museum, Marta. It's a liability. Nobody wants this." Jenna, who was sitting on the floor surrounded by open notebooks, looked up. "Actually, 43 families have contacted us in the last 6 weeks, so maybe somebody wants this." Dale left without another word. Mayor Breslin called a town meeting. He expected to rally support for demolition. Instead, he found a room divided. Half the town wanted the station gone. It was old. It was expensive. It was in the way. The other half had started to remember what it meant. A man named Arthur Voss stood up and said his father had proposed to his mother on that platform in 1952. A woman named Grace DeLuca said her family had arrived in Harwick through that station in 1931, straight off a boat from Naples. A teenager, a friend of Jenna's, said he'd found his great-grandmother's handwriting in one of the recipe notebooks, and his mother had cried for an hour. The meeting ended without a vote. But something had shifted. Spring came to Harwick like a slow exhale. The snow melted off the station roof and revealed tiles that were cracked but still holding. Marta opened the station's front doors for the first time in 37 years and let the light in. It poured through the arched windows and hit the oak ticket counter, and for a moment the dust motes caught the sun, and the whole room looked the way it must have looked in 1923 when the first train pulled in and the whole town came to watch. Walt repaired the platform with lumber donated by a contractor from Uniontown who had heard about the station on a local radio show. He worked slowly, carefully, the way he had done everything in his railroad days, measuring twice, cutting once, whistling songs from the 1970s that nobody recognized, but everyone found comforting. Jenna painted the window frames. She chose yellow, the same color as the original trim which she'd found in a photograph from 1941 that had been pinned inside one of the lockers. Elaine published a series of articles tracing the histories of the objects in the lockers. The stories were extraordinary in their ordinariness. A violin that had belonged to a coal miner's daughter who played at weddings. A set of watercolors left by a traveling painter who had spent one summer in Harwick and never returned. Postcards from a lonely mother to a daughter who had stopped answering the phone. Notebooks full of soup recipes from a woman who had fed railroad workers from her kitchen window every evening for 20 years. None of these were famous people. None of these objects were worth money. But each one was a thread in the fabric of a town that had spent decades unraveling. And when Marta pulled those threads back into the light, something began to hold together again. The county waived the back taxes. A preservation grant came through from the State Historical Commission. Not much, but enough to fix the roof and bring the electrical up to code. A retired architect from Pittsburgh volunteered to draw up plans for a permanent community archive on the second floor. And Marta began to understand Gerald. He had not been a hoarder. He had been a keeper. He had seen what was being lost, the small, everyday evidence of lives lived in a place that the world had decided didn't matter. And he had saved it, locker by locker, tag by tag, in the only building that made sense. The station where all those lives had once passed through. He had never told anyone because Gerald had never known how to talk to people. He had only known how to take care of things. And these lockers, this archive of the unclaimed, was his way of taking care of an entire town. One evening in April, Marta found a locker she had missed. It was in the back, behind a shelf, tagged with a date, March 12th, 1984, the day their mother died. Inside was a small cardboard box. In the box were 3 things. Arlene Backwood's reading glasses, a photograph of Marta at 16 sitting on the station platform with a notebook in her lap, and a folded piece of paper in Gerald's handwriting. It said, "She was the one who remembered everyone. I am the one who kept the proof." Marta held the note against her chest and stood in the silence of the station for a very long time. Dale Hunton made one final attempt. He arrived in May with a revised proposal, a compromise that would preserve the station's facade while gutting the interior for commercial use. He brought glossy renderings. He brought projected revenue figures. He brought Mayor Breslin, who stood slightly behind him, looking uncomfortable. Marta met them at the door. Behind her stood Walt, Jenna, Elaine, and a dozen townspeople who had become regulars at the station, volunteers who sorted, researched, cleaned, and welcomed the families who came from across 3 states to reclaim pieces of their past. "Dale," Marta said, and her voice was steady. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 67 years listening, and who had finally decided it was time to speak. "I spent 40 years being the person who filed things and answered phones and kept quiet. I nursed my mother for 7 years, while my brother disappeared. I let a man call me dependable for 11 years, and then walk away without even drying the dishes. I let a college hand me a box and say thank you for your service. I have been quiet my entire life. I have been invisible my entire life." She paused. The station was silent. Behind her, Jenna had stopped typing. Walt had taken off his cap. Elaine was watching with the careful attention of a woman who knows she is witnessing something that will be written down. "I am not being quiet anymore. This building is not a blight. It is not a liability. It is not junk. It is the memory of every person who ever passed through this town and left something behind: a shoe, a letter, a uniform, a recipe, a piece of themselves they didn't know they had dropped, including me. I passed through this town 42 years ago, and I dropped my whole life on the platform, and I didn't even notice. You can build your storage units somewhere else, Dale. You can put your climate-controlled boxes on any empty lot in this county. But there is only one Harwick Junction, and this station stays. Dale opened his mouth. Mayor Breslin put a hand on his arm and shook his head slowly. They left. At the next council meeting, the Harwick Junction station was designated a community heritage site by unanimous vote. Even the mayor voted yes. He later told Elaine, off the record, that his grandmother had once worked the lunch counter at the station in 1949, and he'd found her name in one of Gerald's notebooks. Now it is autumn again in Harwick. The station is open 3 days a week. The main hall holds rotating exhibits of returned objects and the stories behind them, each one written on a card in Marta's clear, careful handwriting. The East Wing, with its rows of lockers, is preserved exactly as Gerald left it, with a small plaque at the entrance that reads, "Kept by Gerald Backwood, 1987 to 2023, for the ones who passed through." The second floor is a community archive, where anyone in Harwick can bring their family photographs, their old letters, their faded documents, and know that they will be preserved. Jenna Merrick, who finished her community service 6 months ago, still comes every Saturday. She is applying to library science programs in the fall. She told Marta she wants to be the person who makes sure nothing gets lost. Walt Penrose gives tours on Wednesday afternoons, telling visitors about the railroad and the men who worked it, pointing out the window where his friend Rudy Cherney used to lean out and wave at his wife waiting on the platform. His voice cracks every time. He doesn't mind. Elaine Poole's series on the station won a regional press award. The Harwick Messenger is now 20 pages. It still might not survive, but it has a reason to exist, and that is more than it had a year ago. Marta lives above the station now, in the old station master's apartment that Walt and a crew of volunteers renovated over the summer. It is small, 400 square feet, 1 bedroom, a kitchen the size of a closet. It is the first place that has ever felt like hers. She does not sit on a porch at sunset. She stands on the platform at dusk, watching the light move across the empty tracks, and she thinks about her mother, who remembered everyone, and her brother, who kept the proof, and herself, who, after 67 years of carrying other people's burdens in silence, finally found the one worth carrying out loud. If you're still listening, I want to talk to you for a moment. Not about Marta, about you. Maybe you've spent years being the one who holds things together, the one who remembers birthdays, who keeps the house running, who listens when nobody else will. Maybe someone once called you dependable, and you knew that it wasn't enough, that it was a way of saying, you are useful but not remarkable. You are needed but not valued. I want you to hear this. The things you've carried, the years, the patience, the invisible work, the silence, those things are not lost. They are stored up. They are waiting. And one day, in a place you didn't expect, in a building or a box or a corner of your life that everyone else has written off as worthless, you will find them again. And you will discover that they were never burdens at all. They were proof that you were here, that you mattered, that you held things together when everything was falling apart. Marta Backwood did not find hidden money. She did not build an empire. She did not get revenge on anyone. She did something harder and rarer. She turned a crumbling building full of forgotten things into a place where an entire town remembered who it was. And in doing so, she remembered who she was too. Because your story isn't over. It's not too late to open the door, to pull the dust cloths off your own abandoned rooms, and to say, I am still here. I still have something to give. Dreams don't age. They just wait for you to come back to them. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment. Tell me one word, just one word, that describes the moment you realized your own worth. I'll see you in the next story.